should be taught a personal religion. Rousseau explains this religion at some length and with typical fervour. This is very much his own version of Christianity. Despite his unorthodoxies, Rousseau would always remain a man of deep religious feeling. Yet his rejection of religious dogma and the teachings of the Church were equally heartfelt. His articles of faith were simple. He believed in God's love of humanity and in the immortality of the soul. Beyond all rational dictates or religious authority was the divine voice of the soul in man. With consistent inconsistency, he even goes so far as to back this simple faith with rational argument. Ultimately, all physical and bodily emotion in the world is commanded by a wise and powerful will. This is God. And how does he know this? I see it, or rather, I feel it. The design of the world indicates the loving kindness of the being who created it. Elsewhere, Rousseau would back this argument with more personal psychological reasons, which would seem in his case to run closer to the truth. I have suffered too much to live without faith. Rousseau covers a wide range of topics in Émile. Many of the ideas in this work are as original as its author. In so many ways, his vision of humanity was far ahead of its time. Yet, curiously, despite the leading role they had played in his life, he had little of originality to say about women. For once, his views were very much of their time. The proper purpose of women is to produce children. He goes on to claim, what are failings for men are women's good qualities. The self-centeredness behind such views soon becomes apparent. Women ought to direct their knowledge to the study of men and the understanding of taste. The context of this remark makes it clear that the aim of the former study was not scientific, in order to gain knowledge of an apparently alien species, for instance. This study was intended to enable women to support men better. On the other hand, the placing of men and taste in different categories was perhaps not entirely intentional. When Émile was published in 1762, it caused a sensation. The Archbishop of Paris was not the only one to be outraged by Rousseau's views on religion. The Parlement went so far as to order the public executioner to burn the book publicly, along with the immediate arrest of its author. Even Rousseau's powerful protector, the Maréchal de Luxembourg, was unable to defend him from the wrath of the authorities. All he could do was provide Rousseau with a fast carriage to flee the country. Sophie, Madame de Luxembourg, and several other of his female well-wishers lined up to bid him a tearful farewell, and he sped off in the nick of time. In the best traditions of French farce, Rousseau's speeding carriage even passed the carriage containing the officers sent to arrest him, speeding in the opposite direction. Rousseau fled to Switzerland, wisely choosing to make for the canton of Bern rather than his native Geneva, where renewed book-burning had already begun. But he was soon obliged to leave Bern, just ahead of another banning order. For the rest of his life he would remain a fugitive, his oversensitive character degenerating ever deeper into paranoia in the process. Eventually he managed to reach England, where he was befriended by the Scottish philosopher Hume. But by now Rousseau was all but certifiably insane. Dressed theatrically in Armenian costume, his moods were liable to swing from ecstasy to tears, his paranoia constantly goaded by the vindictive Thérèse, whom he saw as the only person never to betray him. His passionate embraces for Hume in the evening would be followed by vituperative letters in the morning. After 17 months of emotional mayhem, Rousseau decided to return secretly to France. Dressed incognito in his trademark Armenian costume, he stepped ashore at Calais. Fortunately, he was soon given refuge by powerful aristocratic protectors. He would end up staying in semi-secrecy at a cottage on the estate of the Marquis de Girardin at Armenonville. Incredibly, given his mental state, it was during this period that Rousseau produced what many regard as his finest work, his Confessions. This is literature rather than philosophy, though it contains much penetrating psychological speculation on a subject Rousseau considered to be of deep philosophical importance, himself. He declares, I would like to be somehow able to make my heart transparent as crystal, so that it cannot hide any of its movements. He is as good as his word, and the result is a switchback of emotion from the immensely moving to the farcical. Yet he knows what he is doing, and his insights into himself cannot help but strike a chord in the reader. Even his attempts to justify the unjustifiable make heart-rending reading. He ends with a challenging declaration, Whoever will examine my nature, my character, my morals, my likings, my pleasures, and my habits with his own eyes, and will be able to believe me a dishonourable man, should himself be throttled. Both the naked honesty of this remark and the violence would bear fruit. Despite everything, there were still moments of peace. Rousseau was now more convinced than ever that Thérèse was the only person who had never betrayed him. At the age of 56, he finally married her. This took place at a curious ceremony conducted by himself, during which all present burst into tears. Thérèse responded by later falling in love with the Marquis de Girardin's English valet. In between writing, Rousseau would row on a nearby lake. Here he felt out of reach of my wicked persecutors. Once again he found solace in nature. Often, leaving my boat to the mercy of wind and water, I abandoned myself to reveries. Sometimes I cried out with emotion, "O nature, O my mother, here I am under your sole protection." On July 1st, 1778, he collapsed. Next day, as he lay in bed, he addressed the blue sky through his open window. "The gate is open, and God awaits me." He tried to get up, fell forward, and died in the arms of Thérèse. He was 66. 11 years later, the French Revolution would put an end to the Ancien Régime, ushering in the France of liberty, equality, fraternity. For better or worse, Rousseau's ideas had entered the public domain. Here they would play their part in inspiring the best and the worst of political developments during the ensuing 2 centuries. From the joyful liberty of the early days of the Revolution to the days when so many were forced to be free during the Terror, through Romanticism and 19th-century social utopianism, through 20th-century communism with its ideals and its horrors, through fascism to the social revolution of the 60s, all these would contain ingredients of Rousseau's ideas. Such was the power of his thought that it could not simply be dismissed by pointing out its inconsistencies. Such were its ecstatic gestures, its liberty, its irrationalities, and its unconsidered consequences, that it was perhaps bound to provoke excess. Yet much of this very same thought has quietly settled to become the bedrock of our modern belief about ourselves, as well as our instinctive expectations of a just society. From Rousseau's writings. Consider, by contrast, the morals of the few nations who have been preserved from the contagion of useless knowledge. By their virtues they have become happy in themselves, and provide a shining example to all. Thus were the first inhabitants of Persia a nation so exceptional that its inhabitants were taught virtue in the same way as we are taught the sciences. These were the Persians who conquered Asia with ease, and achieved the rare glory of having the history of their political institutions read by posterity as a philosophical romance. So also were the Scythians, of whom history speaks so highly. So also were the early Germanic people, whose simplicity of living, innocence, and virtue were such a delight to the historian Tacitus, when he became sick of describing the crimes and degeneracies of his own enlightened, opulent, and voluptuous people. So also were the Romans themselves in the early days of their poverty and ignorance. Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts. The first man who enclosed a piece of land, who then came up with the idea of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. How many crimes, wars, and murders stem from this act? How much misery and horror the human race would have been spared if someone had simply pulled out the stakes and filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow men, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to everyone, and that the earth itself belongs to no one." Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Many a person believes himself to be the master of others, and yet he is in reality a greater slave than they are. How has this change come about? I do not know. What can render it legitimate? I believe that I have the answer to this question. If I considered only the use of force and its results, I should say that for as long as people are forced to obey, and do obey, it works fairly well. But as soon as these people are able to shake off their yoke and do so by force, things become better. For if people recover their freedom in the same way as it was taken away from them, either they are justified in so gaining their freedom, or there was no justification for taking away their freedom in the first place. Social contract. Everything is good in so far as it is given to us by the hands of the author of nature. Yet everything degenerates in the hands of man. He forces one country to nurture what is produced in another, one tree to bear the fruits of another. He mixes up and confuses the climates, the elements, and even the seasons. He mutilates his dog, his horse, and his slave. He turns everything upside down and disfigures everything. He loves deformity and monsters. He will have nothing as nature made it, not even himself. Like a wild horse, he must be first broken in before he is fit for man's service. He must be shaped according to his own fancy, like a tree in his garden. Emile, or On Education. I am made quite too much to live without faith. Rousseau covers a wide range of topics in Emile. Many of the ideas in this work are as original as its author. In so many ways, his vision of humanity was far ahead of its time. Yet, curiously, despite the leading role they had played in, with consistent inconsistency, he even goes so far as to back this simple faith with rational argument. Ultimately, all physical and bodily emotion in the world is commanded by a wise and powerful will. This is God. And how does he know this? I see it, or rather, I feel it. The design of the world indicates the loving kindness of the being who created it. Elsewhere, Rousseau would back this argument with more personal psychological reasons, which would seem in his case to run closer to the truth. I have suffered should be taught a personal religion. Rousseau explains this religion at some length and with typical fervour. This is very much his own version of Christianity. Despite his unorthodoxies, Rousseau would always remain a man of deep religious feeling. Yet his rejection of religious dogma and the teachings of the Church were equally heartfelt. His articles of faith were simple. He believed in God's love of humanity and in the immortality of the soul. Beyond all rational dictates or religious authority was the divine voice of the soul in man.